Among the laundry list of assessment questions at a meeting with a therapist, the therapist said, do you ever wake up in the morning feeling like you're on top of the world? This is a person suffering from a kind of depression. She said, yes, but not too often. Well, do you ever wake up feeling grumpy in the morning, or just being grumpy in the morning, or do you wake up grumpy in the morning? She said, no, I let him sleep. He always has an attitude, she said. And then they got down to some real therapy. This reminds me of seminary days in New York City. A lot of things do. My wife Pat's brother is Robert, and he lives in Florida now. He and I were roommates for one of those years there. My frequent little wake-up joke on him while he was trying to figure out how to turn the alarm clock off, and while he was struggling to wake up, was to play a full-blast version of a spirited piano recording, and it was called NOLA. Do you know that? Somebody? Oh, Sharon knows. But have you heard it full blast volume on a piano? Well, I turned up the volume loud, and I said to Robert as he was struggling to get out of bed, Robert, you have an attitude this morning. Still strikes me awfully funny. Attitudes, well, I remind him every time I really do see him, he remembers very, very clearly. Attitudes are important, and we all have attitudes. Some are ornery attitudes, some complain and criticize rather than to compliment and affirm others. Some are happy, positive attitudes about many, many things. There are all kinds of attitudes. They have to do with how you and I view things, issues, circumstances, people with whom we find ourselves. Attitudes determine whether we get up on the wrong side or the right side of the bed in the morning, as we refer to it. Attitudes have to do how we see and relate to people, whether they are fun to be with, interesting enough to really listen to, or irritating when they're interrupting something that we're doing. Do any of you have attitudes about anything that ever trouble you, about your relationships among friends or in marriages or members of another generation, the older or the younger? You have to think about that this afternoon. I know I'm not giving you time to think very long about it right now. But get a piece of paper and pencil and think about what attitudes do I have, and which ones do I want to keep, and which ones do I want to change. Any attitudes you'd like to change in yourself if you knew how. So knowing how is the other piece. Some attitudes breed joyful, fruitful lives, while other attitudes grab hold of us and bring life down, and relationships along with them. And a familiar example of a negative attitude that brings life down is the poor me. Have you ever known anyone who harbors and nurtures poor me? You ever done that? Were you aware of yourself when you were doing that? Somebody ever pointed out to you? And you get defensive? Or maybe you heard. The poor me attitude, when you're infected with it, leads nowhere but to a dead-end street. Hoping that someone will come running to the rescue, and yet it is that very attitude itself, often spending energy pointing a finger and criticizing, that tends to discourage and drive people away. The very thing we are not looking for. For someone caught up in the poor me attitude. Someone is caught up in that. Nothing much that others can do brings about a change in that attitude, and if it doesn't, over a period of time, some people stop trying to bring us back out of that. They get discouraged too. The person stuck in that attitude is busy being part of a problem, whereas a person with an attitude of optimism becomes busy finding ways to become part of, a solution to the problems as they arise. The attitudes we each have for living are very important factors. Have you taken a look at your attitudes lately? Part of that is our prayer confession. Part of it is just taking time for meditation and self-reflection. Some attitudes are very difficult to change. In the book of Acts, that Deb just read to us from, we hear the story of one named Saul, who went through an incredible change of attitude toward God and people around him. Saul went from being one of the fiercest enemies of the early Christians to becoming one of their foremost leaders, teachers, and preachers. Educated, well steeped in the traditions of his Jewish legalism of the day, Saul saw the early followers of Jesus straying from some of the time-honored traditions of the Old Testament. He thought he was right in arresting Christians, forcibly bringing them before the Jewish council in Jerusalem, until one day he experienced the risen Christ. Christians who had come to regard Saul with fear in the past were hesitant to trust that his change in attitude toward them was genuine and not just a trick to pull them in. A prime example from the verses read by Deb today would be the man named Ananias, who shortly after Saul's radical change of heart, conversion of attitude, was asked to deliver a message to Saul. To me, that would be like a zookeeper telling me the lion has been recently fed at the Bronx Zoo, now I can go in the cage and pat his head. When Ananias was asked to visit Saul, his first thought was, I've heard about this man, about how much evil he does to the followers of Christ. Ananias understandably found it difficult to shake this attitude, this fear, this distrust of Saul, who had hurt so many people. However, in prayer, just as insights often come to us when we are in prayer, Ananias was suddenly taken with the thought that God had a plan to use Saul, and that Ananias was to be part of this plan. What an amazing insight. Certainly, Jesus himself had impressed people around him by choosing unlikely leaders to become some of his disciples, God stopping Saul in his tracks and then calling him to an abrupt change of attitude toward Christians should not be out of the realm of possibilities either. So Ananias got up his courage. He went to see Saul, something like going into the lion's cage to pat the head of the king of the jungle. So Ananias went to the home where Saul was temporarily residing and put his hands on Saul, and he said, Brother Saul, which is the rough equivalent of the welcoming words, fellow Christian. Wow. Saul wasn't the only one in this account who underwent an abrupt change of attitude in his heart and mind. Ananias' ingrained attitude towards Saul was also radically changed. It was no accident that both of these men's attitudes were radically changed by the fact that the risen Christ was at work in their relationship. Ananias himself says to Saul, Saul, the Lord Jesus who appeared to you is the same Lord Jesus who sent me here to you. The risen Christ was working in their relationship. In this illustration, the Bible clearly shows us that the Spirit of the risen Christ at work in our relationships has the power to be a great changer of our personal and inner attitudes, if we let him. And not only that, we should be able to trust our risen Lord to change our inner attitudes for the better. It's risky to change, but our hope is that it will be better. And it always is. In other words, we can learn from him, become better and more faithful people by welcoming him into our living relationships. Saul's attitude toward followers of Christ radically changed as he became one of them. And Ananias' attitude toward Saul radically changed as he took the risk of entering the lion's den, finding that Saul was no longer into biting people. Though it would still take considerable time for Christians in general to trust Saul's conversion and his change of attitude, it all had its beginnings right then and there. Just like it is for us when we have an insight and a revelation and a sudden change of attitude. The rest is history, as we all know that Saul, his Hebrew birth name, later became known as Paul. His Christian missionary work extended further into the Greek and Roman Empire of his times. First Saul, then he was known as Paul, as his inner attitude changed and led him into the far countries of his day with a message and a preacher of the risen Christ. In this story, the Bible blesses us with a valuable piece of guidance. The attitudes that you and I harbor in our personalities affect a lot of our relationships. The attitudes we have toward our possessions. The attitudes we have toward politics. The attitudes we have about the meaning of life and the purpose of each day. The attitudes we have toward our work are many. Some see daily work as exciting and feel passionate about it, can't wait to do it, and others say a job is a job is a job, and I need the money. Well, attitude makes all the difference. The inner attitudes harbored in each of us profoundly affect relationships. Attitudes have the power to build or destroy relationships. Attitudes can open doors to new people in our lives. They can also slam doors in people's faces and keep them at a safe distance. Something that feels safe to us. Doesn't mean it's good for us. Some inner attitudes make a person a good, interested, understanding, compassionate listener to the concerns and viewpoints of others, even when these viewpoints are not one's own. Other attitudes give rise to poor listeners, though they may be good interrupters. Some folks have great difficulty dealing constructively with the differing opinions of others, and even choose to walk away from those conversations. In those cases, the topic seems to be more important than the person, the relationship. That's a big distinction when an issue becomes more important than the person you're with. Attitudes have the power to heal, build, restore, encourage, celebrate, and improve things. And likewise, unexamined attitudes can sometimes destroy, tear down, injure relationships, and overlook the most important things that make life worthwhile and precious. Namely, finding Christian love and care between all people. Of interest to anyone trying to follow the risen Christ is the question, as a Christian, what attitudes should I have and how can I get them? I would like to just close with a final illustration back in the days of college chemistry, which I loved. I especially enjoyed doing experiments in the lab. I'd prepare all the ingredients separately and have the theory and the steps of the procedure down pat and clearly written out, and then I'd start mixing things together. At first there was often no noticeable change, and then I would turn on the Bunsen burner under the flask or the test tube to heat the mixture to a certain range of temperature and perhaps add an additional substance called a catalyst to enable the reaction that I was looking for to take place. And then all kinds of changes would begin to occur as the chemical changes occurred and the recombinations of atoms and compounds began. Well, Jesus is the one ingredient that has the power to revolutionize and transform one's inner attitudes in ways they need to be changed for the better. Be careful what you pray for, because it can happen. If you're praying for the right things, you'll experience Christ in your life and in relationship. Anyone who humbly and truthfully wants help with their attitudes, sincerely desires that they be examined in the light of knowing the Spirit of the risen Christ, will not be disappointed. He is standing at the door of your heart, the door of your mind, knocking, seeking admission, so he can show you the way, the truth, and the life, just like he said he was. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The Lord loves you the way you are, but a relationship with him won't leave you unchanged. Careful what you pray for. First Saul, then Paul. Now, how about you?